It's time to gather loved ones together for all the holidays' best spread. Lynn's has great prices on all your favorite Thanksgiving items, from delicious turkey with all the fixings to mashed potatoes and yummy pies. We have everything you need to create your perfect Thanksgiving dinner. Whether it's cooking the traditional meal, completely store-bought, or a combination of both, your best holiday meal starts here. Learn more and start shopping today at lynsgrocery.com. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
Welcome to the Attention Deficit Disorder Expert Podcast Series by Attitude Magazine.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carol Fleck, and on behalf of the Attitude team, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's ADHD Experts presentation titled School Avoidance and Refusal, Root Causes and Strategies for Parents and Educators. Leading today's presentation is Alana Cooperman. Alana is a senior social worker for the Anxiety Disorder Center at the Child Mind Institute. She works with children and families with anxiety disorders, ADHD, and emotional regulation issues. She provides evidence-based treatment in individual and group therapy. She also has worked with school administrators, teachers, families, and other clinicians to support students at school. As many of you know, student absenteeism is a growing problem. Anxiety is often the underlying cause for this behavior. Anxiety might stem from academic struggles, from bullying or peer rejection at school, or due to trauma or trouble at home. Whatever the reason, the outcome is often the same. Students refuse to go to school, miss classwork and tests, and fall even farther behind. In today's webinar, caregivers and educators will learn how to identify and address the underlying causes for school avoidance so that students can return to class feeling supported and hopeful. So without further ado, I'm so pleased to welcome Alana Cooperman. Thank you so much for joining us today and leading this discussion.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm Alana Cooperman, and I work at the Anxiety Disorder Center at the Child Mind Institute in New York City. At the Child Mind Institute, we are an independent national nonprofit dedicated to transforming the lives of children and families struggling with all sorts of mental health and learning disorders. At the Child Mind Institute, we focus on these three components. One of them is research. So we really are at the forefront of neuroscience efforts to find biological measures of mental illness that will lead to earlier diagnoses and find better interventions. We also have a lot of public education on our website and equip millions of parents and educators with tons of resources and information to help end the stigma around a lot of misinformation of diagnoses. And our biggest piece is our clinical care. We provide world-class clinical care to children struggling with mental health and learning disorders. Today's agenda will be covering these three topics. The first is defining what is school refusal. The second will be talking about anxiety, ADHD, and school refusal and how they have something to do with one another. And then we'll be talking about supportive strategies and interventions for children with school refusal behaviors. So we start with talking about what is school refusal. School refusal is when children age 5 through 17 refuse to go to school. And it can be a little bit earlier or a little bit later, we see in different ages, but that is what school refusal is defined as. It is not a diagnosis, and it's also not when a child misses school because of an illness or the family is homeless or there's lacking childcare. There's a lot of misinformation around school refusal and what it is. And often parents get blamed, right? And schools get blamed. And the identity of what it's coming from is confusing and not talked about. And that's why we're here today. What we do know about school refusal is it's a symptom of underlying struggles, typically associated with one or more of the following. So it's not limited to this list, but these are the most common diagnoses that we see with children with school refusal behaviors: ADHD, learning disorder, social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety, and separation disorder. When we talk about school refusal, we define it by the length of the time the problem's lasted. So an acute problem of school refusal is when a child has it for 2 weeks up to a year. A chronic problem would be when that lasts longer than a year, and we can see it up to 2 years and sometimes longer. If school refusal is not treated, we do see short-term and long-term effects, which is important to see the big picture. Short-term is when we see a decline in grades. We see a child alienating themselves from their peers. We see a lot of family tension in the home, and we see a lot of regression in the milestones that they should be reaching. Long-term, we see children who have trouble graduating. We see that increased tension in the home and struggles in their family. And as they become adults, we see that follow them. We also see anxiety follow them as well, and increase in anxiety and depression and potential substance abuse as adults, which is why it's so important that we get treatment for these behaviors. So what can school refusal look like? I made 2 lists for us here. One is the more obvious symptoms and one is the less obvious. Though for you, these can vary, right? For every child, school refusal looks very different. For elementary age children, we see commonly, right, the refusal to actually physically go into school. We see trouble separating from the parent. Maybe they're clinging or grabbing to you. We see tantrums when it comes to talking about homework, talking about school, doing homework at night. And we see verbalized worries about school. They're saying they don't want to go. They're saying they're worried. They're saying they're upset. We also see a physical running away and avoiding actually going or running away from home. For older kids, it looks a little bit different in terms of the refusal. Sometimes finishing a morning routine, they might stop, or at night, they might refuse or kind of procrastinate to do their homework. We see older kids leave school early, try to skip class, try and avoid class or avoid certain parts of the day by going to other areas of the school or going to the nurse. We also just see a lot of negative talk. But the less obvious symptoms can sometimes be sleep struggles, either falling asleep or waking up in the middle of the night. For younger kids, they complain of stomach, headaches, or nausea or vomiting. These symptoms can vary. We do see them in older children, but sometimes older children have more physical symptoms of panic attacks, and they describe it in a different way. For younger kids, the teachers might report that there's a change of behavior noticed in the classroom. Their mood might shift either at home or in school, and they generally start to have worries about other things as well. For older kids, we see that defiance, right? Kids may not be able to outwardly say, this is really hard, I'm struggling. And so we see that in the defiant behavior at home or in school. For older kids, we also see a lot of irritability and anger towards peers and family members. We also see an increase in their self-consciousness, whether it be how they're performing academically, how they're doing in front of their friends, and embarrassment of many different things, including how they physically look, how they feel when they come in late, how they feel when they're not doing work, and how they think people are perceiving them. When we talk about school refusal, we think about the risk factors that put a child at risk for having school refusal behaviors. Again, this is very different for every child, but we have 3 main categories here. The biggest one and the most common one we see is academic risk. So a child who has a lot of difficult classes or struggling in school, and that can come from ADHD and learning disability or just ADHD. It can come from other anxieties or other disabilities that they're struggling with. We know that children with ADHD have very poor executive functioning. Again, this is not every child, but a child who has poor executive functioning, which means organizing of their work, planning their homework, putting their things in their backpack, deciding what to do first. All of those fall under the category of what's called executive functioning. And if those skills are poor, they're at risk for eventually having trouble going to school. We also know the homework load and pressure can be a lot for children, whether it come from teachers or home. Not every home has pressure, but it's a good thing to pay attention to if it's there because it can put a child at risk. And a child who's out of school a lot, whether it be asthma or something else, that prolonged absence can put them at risk for eventually not wanting to go to school. We also see a lot of children with social struggles, whether they have ADHD and social anxiety, or they just have trouble with conflicts with friends. It can be very, very challenging for a child to want to go to school if these conflicts are happening on the daily, right? And if their social anxiety is not being treated, they're going to feel more and more self-conscious and more alienated in front of their friends. If they're feeling bullied and it's not being addressed, that can make it really hard to want to go to school. And that over time can be a risk factor. There's also personal struggles. So if there's family conflict, if there's trauma experienced either by the child or by the family as a whole, if there's a death or a loss in the family, those are all putting the child potentially at risk. But it's worth and important to note that that doesn't mean every child, right? Not every child who has a death in their family will be at risk. But it's important to think about how they're functioning with their ADHD in school with all other supports around them. There are 4 functional conditions of school refusal. Whenever we talk about behaviors, we talk about what's the function, right? Function means what's driving the behavior, what's happening for them to act in this way. So when we talk about school refusal, we're wondering what's causing it, which is often the number one question with school refusal. It's important to know, right, that this is very general, but it can be very specific for your child or a child in your classroom if you're a teacher. But children often refuse school for more than one of the following. The first is avoidance of school-based stimuli that can provoke a negative response or distress. We'll go into each of these in a moment. The second one is avoidance of social or evaluative situations at school that make them anxious. The third is gaining parent or caregiver attention. And the fourth is gaining access to tangible rewards at home. The first 2 are what we call negative reinforcement. It's to get away from something negative at school, something that brings those negative emotions that they want to get away from and avoid. And they're typically associated with underlying anxieties in a child. We see these 2 the most common, though the other ones can also be present. And a child may have more than one function. The first one's avoidance of school-based stimuli, an object or a person that provokes negative emotion. It can be a teacher, it can be a classroom, a space in the school, it can be a specific peer, it can be a specific class. So it can be very specific for each child. And when we learn about these functions, it really helps us understand how can we support them better. What supports do they need? And it will help us create a treatment plan for them when we work with the school, which we'll talk about soon. The second one's avoidance of social or evaluative situations. And this is very common for kids with ADHD because they do feel that pressure where in the classroom, they're getting evaluated by doing tests or doing homework, handing in homework, and all of that can make them feel very anxious in regard to being evaluated about performance and all that academic stress. But it also can be social. We see a lot of children with ADHD and social anxiety in knowing how to handle challenging peer interactions that they would rather avoid. And we also see other kind of struggles that children with social anxiety may have, whether it be raising their hand to ask a question in class. It could be standing in front of the class and doing a presentation. It could be joining a group and working at a group project. If all of these things are difficult, that can make it very challenging to be in school. And so that is an important function for us to know so we can get to the root of how to help. The other 2 functions serve as a positive reinforcement, something they want to have access to. So the first one here says gaining parent caregiver attention. It can be for a child who has separation anxiety, a child who wants to stay close to a parent, perhaps who's often gone. It could be just wanting extra attention if there's some family dynamics that are difficult. And it could just be a child who struggles with separating in general with someone in their family. We don't see this as commonly, but it can be there. And the fourth one is gaining access to things at home. That could be video games, their iPad, hanging out with other friends who they know will be home, or hanging out or doing different activities that they want to do that they don't think they get enough time with. So it is so important where we start with the function to know what is the reason this is happening. So then we can create a plan for how we can support. At first, when we see school refusal, we don't realize there's a function underneath, which is why it can be very vital here for us as people working in the school, people working in therapy, and for home to know where is this coming from so we can know what to change. We're now going to talk about ADHD, anxiety, and school refusal and what they have to do with one another. When we talk about anxiety, we know that it's a normal and adaptive bodily system that tells us when we're in danger. We all have it, and it's a good thing we teach kids to have. If you're crossing the street here in New York City, it's dangerous at times. You need to look around, and if a car is coming your way, anxiety tells us to quickly move, right? So anxiety can be a safe, important thing to have. However, when we have a lot of anxiety, and commonly children and adults with ADHD do have anxiety, we often have a system in our body that we call a false alarm telling us that something is wrong, that there's danger when there's actually not. And so our false alarms start to go off when there's a non-threatening situation. But your brain and your body is reading it as this is dangerous. Something bad is here. Something bad is happening. We need to go into fight, flight, or freeze response. Fight or flight are the common ones that people hear, but we add freeze here because sometimes kids don't know what to do and do nothing and cannot move. But we often see flight when there's anxiety. Avoidance is a very, very common reaction for kids who have anxiety and ADHD. And for anyone with anxiety, if you think about something you don't like as an adult, avoidance is a very common reaction. And we're going to talk about what to do when there's avoidance. For children who have ADHD, there are a lot of struggles that they face on the daily that can increase their anxiety. So school in general can be very challenging on different levels, and this can vary per child, right? For some kids, it's math. For some kids, it's reading and writing. And for some kids, it's all of it. For children who have ADHD, it can be very hard to focus, right? And so they're very easily distracted. You then pair that with all of the different things hanging around the room. And sometimes there's a sensory overload. They feel very overwhelmed by all the different things around them and all the different information being given to them and told to them. For some kids also with ADHD, executive functioning is a real hard struggle. Like mentioned earlier, organizing their materials, planning out homework, even looking at this backpack, putting things away. I've spoken to so many families who say their backpack looks like a disaster. How are they supposed to know what's going on if I can't even figure out what's going on in there? So it's really, really important to identify what are these struggles in their ADHD characteristics that are increasing their anxiety. Catching on to those earlier can make it really helpful to then see what pattern they need and what supports they need as they continue on. Children with ADHD also struggle with impulsivity. And for many kids that I work with who have ADHD and anxiety, they can be really embarrassed by their impulses, whether it be bumping people, whether it be blurting things out in the middle of class, sometimes calling someone a name, or just calling out the answer. Those impulses can cause a sense of embarrassment and shame, and that can make it increasingly anxious to be in the school setting. And as we mentioned earlier, difficult peer relationships and joining conversation can make anxiety increase for kids with ADHD. And lastly, which we'll talk about more in a few minutes, kids who have ADHD often are thinking about a lot of things. The one thing I always tell families with ADHD is it's not that they can't focus, they're focusing on everything, right? And so they also are overthinking everything because their brain is thinking about so many things. They have a great mind, but sometimes we need help to scale down some of that thinking because it can lead to more increased anxiety. For children with ADHD, these struggles and anxiety can lead to school refusal if it's not treated or supported, and here's how. First, when all of these things we just discussed, right, we saw that backpack, we saw all the work that's coming home and the struggle to organize all of that, the information they're taking in and bringing home. How do I organize all these things that I'm getting, and what do I do with this? They might start falling behind in their work. When they start falling behind, they start to get frustrated, and parents do too, right? We start to see a decrease in confidence because right away, a child's feeling really frustrated. They can't do this work. They might even feel embarrassed. They're starting to feel badly about themselves. And how we see it often is defiance. Kids don't often have the words to say, my confidence is starting to go low, right? Or I'm feeling really frustrated because I'm falling behind because of that sensory overload I'm having at school. We have to pay attention when we see some of these signs here because they may not be able to tell us with their words. So we know that their confidence starts to go low and their frustration increases. We might see defiance at home or in school. Sometimes we only see it at home and parents say, why is that? Often they're holding it in all day and they spill it all out when they're home where they're comfortable. So it's great that they have a place, but it's hard for families. And it can be really tough if we're not catching the why of what's happening, the root of the behavior and that function of some of their stress. If it's not addressed and their defiance continues, we're going to see a decrease in their motivation, right? If they feel like they're falling behind and they don't feel good about who they are, they're going to start to feel, what's the purpose, right? They're going to ask themselves, what do I feel motivated by? Not this stuff that's bringing me all this anxiety. They're going to then want to avoid more. Older kids are going to procrastinate, say, I'll do it later, put it away, say they lost it, they don't know where it is, or just flat out say, I'm not doing it, right? So that avoidance and procrastination eventually can lead to school refusal, and it's almost a full cycle because that will then lead back to falling more behind. When we talk about anxiety, it's important to note that it doesn't just go away on its own. Here we're looking at a sample of what happens when a child thinks they can kind of avoid and get rid of the problem on their own. So we see a picture of a boy looking at a dog. He starts to have a negative thought in his head. The dog is going to bite me. And they start to have those physical reactions where he's sweating and he's having, maybe his heart is racing and he's having negative thoughts and negative feelings. And he runs, right? He wants to get out. He wants to avoid. He goes home to his room and he's sitting there smiling, saying, I'm safe because I got away from the thing I didn't want to be near. He's home and he's happy playing his video games. But what happens when he steps back out? The anxiety is right there in his face because he can't avoid, this is a dog as his neighbor, right? But he can't avoid the thing he's afraid of. In fact, the anxiety can come back even more, even stronger. So it's important to note that when parents or when school staff will say, can it just go away on its own? Can we just see if this kind of goes away? Unfortunately, it cannot. At the Child Mind Institute, we talk about 7 common thinking traps, and I'm going to review what they are and the most common we see with school refusal. A thinking trap is when we have a negative thought pattern where our anxiety is leading us to fully believe that something is wrong. And when we're anxious, we think negatively. So take a moment for yourself and think, when I'm anxious, do I think positive thoughts or negative? It's always negative. And we tell kids those are unhelpful thoughts. We have 7 categories, and the 3 most common ones are fortune telling, mind reading, and labeling for kids with school refusal behaviors. Fortune telling is what we all do sometimes when we're anxious, right? Or we're nervous about something. We start to predict that it's not going to go well. Those are commonly noticed when you hear a child say, what if? What if I go to school and I fail? What if I can't perform in front of the class? What if my friends make fun of me? What if the teachers think something bad about me? What if I walk in late, right? So fortune telling is when we think about all these bad things, and it can even be a statement. It's not going to go well. I can't go to school tomorrow because it's not going to go well. So fortune telling is the most common, as well as mind reading here in the corner to the right. Mind reading is when we assume we know what another person is thinking when we don't, right? But if a child walks into a cafeteria and sees another child smiling or laughing, right away in their head, they're saying they're laughing at me. It's about me. They're making fun of me. That's what they're laughing at. When we have no proof of that. But that's what mind reading does. It traps our thinking into a negative pattern, and we have to help children get out of these, and I'll explain how. But first, it really helps to know what these are. And labeling happens also the bottom left, when we use a single negative word to describe ourselves. And you'll probably relate to this when you think about what it is when children are feeling frustrated and they're saying, I'm a failure. I'm stupid. I'm not smart. And those are negative ways of thinking about themselves, which is not true at all. We're now going to talk about what do we do, right? What do we do when we see that children have all of these functions driving their behavior to not wanting to go to school? What do we do when we notice a child's having these thinking patterns that are so negative, and how do we get out of them? So we'll talk about supportive strategies and interventions here. For school refusal, the treatment is a collaborative approach. It's important that the family and the school and the therapists are all involved together in order to make the most comprehensive treatment plan. The therapeutic intervention that we recommend for school refusal behaviors is called CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. The triangle here on the screen explains the basis of cognitive behavioral therapy, which explains a connection between the 3 corners of the triangle. The first is what we think. The second is how we feel. And the third is how we act. When we do cognitive behavioral therapy with children and adults, we help them understand that how we think and feel directly affect how we act. But we don't often realize we have a thought underlying our actions or underlying how we feel. We often just see the behavior, right? Or in school, when kids are moving fast, we see the behavior because it's the most obvious. We might see how they feel, but we don't always know what the thought is. And so this really involves having empathy when working with children and learning more. We want to know more about what's going on because what's presented is often not what's always there. There's usually more, and there's a thought. In cognitive behavioral therapy, we teach kids that there's a way to change that. So first we have them identify what thinking trap's going on. What are some of the functions? Again, that learning the function helps us learn how to support them. We identify what are those negative thoughts you're having, and then we teach them how to challenge their worry thoughts. When a negative thought is presented, for example, when I go to school, I'm going to do badly at everything. We teach them to challenge that thought with a series of questions that sound like, what are other options? How likely is that to happen? Has it ever happened before? We even sometimes ask kids, what would you tell a friend with this thought? When we think about what are other options, it's helpful because when we have anxiety, it traps us into thinking only the negative thought and only that thought can be true. But when we challenge it to think, well, what else could happen? It helps us replace that negative thought with a positive one. Another main component of cognitive behavioral therapy is something you may or may not have heard of. It's called exposure therapy. Exposure therapy works to help the child avoid the avoidance. So instead of avoiding school, we are putting together a plan to help them gradually get to the thing and face the thing that they're afraid of. We don't just throw them in the school or throw them in front of dogs, whatever they're afraid of. We work in a very systematic and gradual way, which I'll show you and explain as we go. What we're doing here is helping build what's called distress tolerance, our tolerance for things that are uncomfortable. And the more children are exposed to the thing they're afraid of in small incremental doses, the more they teach their body, I can do this even though it feels really uncomfortable and even though it's really hard. They eventually will learn what's called habituation. I can get through this. I can get through this difficult moment, even with all of those things. So we use the example of a child going into a pool, or anyone really, right? Think about when you step into a pool, it's freezing. When you stand there for a moment, all of a sudden the temperature feels a little different, but the temperature didn't change. Your body got used to it. And then you might go in a little bit more, and then you might go in a little bit more. And that's a really good example of what exposure therapy looks like. What you see here is called the worry hill, and it's designed to look just like a hill or a wave. When children first start experiencing the anxiety about school, they start to have those symptoms and they're starting to climb, right? So we know physiologically our bodies have a lot of different symptoms where our eyes actually dilate, our muscles actually tense up, our heart rate and blood pressure increase. And so when those things start to ride up the hill, what happens is it's like when you get, for some people at the top of a roller coaster, there's that exit door and they're like, get me out of here. I'm out. I feel all these symptoms. My heart is racing. I can't do this. And they go through that door and they get out. When children start to have that avoidant behavior, they feel good temporarily, like the boy with the dog, right? He's sitting in his room with the air conditioning, playing video games. But when a child is temporarily experiencing that relief, they're not learning, I can get through this really hard and uncomfortable feeling, and then the anxiety will return. They need to be able to ride that worry hill and go all the way to the peak where they have all those experience emotions and experience physical sensations to learn, I can get through this with obvious supports, which we're going to talk about in a moment. As they experience them, they will coast down and the anxiety will gradually decrease and the feeling will pass. But they won't allow themselves to do that or to learn that they can do that if they all the time try and avoid. And so that's why we use exposure therapy as our main component along with the cognitive piece. This is a sample of a hierarchy. This will look different for every child. This is an example of one I used for a child where we ultimately were getting them to attend a full day of school. For this child, and this will look very different. So this is just a sample. The struggle started getting in and out of a car. So in this example, we broke it down into very, very small steps. We started with getting in and out of the car. The idea here is each step has to be practiced, and we don't move to the next step until one is mastered. We don't expect the child to say, no, I'm no longer anxious at all. But on a scale of 1 to 10, we expect them to move down a little bit. If they started at an 8, we're going to have them practice over and over and over until they reach a 4 or 5. It takes a lot of dedication. It can be really frustrating for parents. So I always say, make sure you have an adult who can do this work with them, because for some kids, it might even start at home. They need to just get up and get in their clothes for school and use that as their first starting point. So this hierarchy will look really different. An important component here is adding on a very motivating reward. For some kids, a snack is not enough. But for some kids, having extra time before bed on their iPad or spending time with a family member is motivating. Or they can earn small things that lead up to a bigger thing. But for each step of the hierarchy, we do recommend motivating them with some type of reward that everyone is aware of. We also teach kids coping strategies so that while they're going through this hierarchy, they have skills that they're learning to handle that physical reaction. We all have them, right? For kids with anxiety, ADHD, and school refusal, they're going to have more of those. So we teach coping strategies as well. We also teach families to shift the attention to positive behaviors and all the effort they're making. Listen, this is really hard work. And I know as someone who worked in a school and also as a therapist and a parent, that it can be really challenging to stay positive. But when we shift our attention to the positive behaviors, it can be a game changer. We also want to make sure we're not rewarding them for staying home. So a sample plan here of what this can look like. And again, this will look different for every family. The idea here is that if a child's getting therapy, the parent is also getting help as well. So the therapist and parent will meet, the child will meet with the therapist as well. The child might get it once a week, twice a week, sometimes 3 times a week. It really varies per child. We also will collaborate with the school and make sure that there's a point person and a go-to, a child-friendly person who that child really feels safe with. That's going to be our person every time the child is doing these steps on the hierarchy. And we have to have a clear and gradual reentry plan that's created by the child, but also the school and the therapist and the parents are all part of it, right? So we need to make sure that it's a very clear and gradual reentry plan. If the child is not ready for a step, then we can't move on. So it has to be gradual. And the reward and consequence system is going to be very clear. When the therapist and parents work together, the idea here is continually understanding why, right? Why is this happening? What is the function of the behavior so that we can help understand what they need? What supports do they need? We also help families create a tracker so that children can feel empowered when they see the progress they've made with their consequences or rewards, right? They need to be able to see it and to continue working on that hierarchy together. We also help parents be aware of your own triggers, which can be really hard also for educators, right? But when we know what our triggers are, we know how we can start to say, okay, I need to take a second and use a coping strategy myself so that I'm not making this worse. And that can be a very challenging step. When we work with the school, we also want to help the school understand what's the function here, because then schools can put in supports. Again, this looks really different for every child, but when the school knows the hierarchy, knows this plan, and there's also a check-in plan with the parents, then they can start to say, as a school, what do we need to do? And this can, again, look very different across children, but it can, for example, be maybe lessening the homework load or changing some deadlines. It can be moving the child's seat or having the child, start their day in the therapist's office. So this can look very different, but it's important to know what the school's expectations are and kind of adjusting them to where the child is at on their hierarchy. We recommend the use of supportive language statements that combine empathy and encouragement. At first, we want to show the child that we hear them, we see what they're experiencing, we know how hard this is, and we're calm. But we're also encouraging them because we know they can do it. So it can sound like this. I can see how scary this is for you, and I really believe you can do this. I see this is really hard for you, and I also know you can do hard things. And sometimes it helps to remind them of a time they were anxious and they got through. So I know you're feeling really anxious right now. And I also know the last time you felt very anxious, you felt so proud of yourself when you pushed through. I see this makes you uncomfortable. Once you're inside, you're going to feel so happy and you're going to love being there. So this is going to sound different for everyone. Now, something that is natural as a parent is to jump in when our child is struggling, right? And we don't want to push them too hard, but it's that struggle of what do I do because I want to help them, but I care about them. And it's hard to see them in distress. Unfortunately, if we remove them from the thing that makes them hard every time, we are continuing that cycle of negative reinforcement. So here's an example. A child's asked to get ready in the morning for school. The child begins to cry and scream. They don't want to go. The parent sees the child begin to get emotional and feels anxious themselves, right? And that's a natural human reaction. When a child or a child of ours or a child in our class is struggling, we want to help and jump in. The parent then might say, it's okay. Like, you don't have to go to school. This is really hard. And then the child and parent calm down. No one's anxious. Unfortunately, now, just like that worry hill, the child has learned, oh, I can get out of this, and that's the way I can get through, instead of pushing through and learning I can get through this difficult moment. So when the child is at risk, there are some risk factors, and that they're starting to have increased anxiety with their ADHD symptoms. You want to create some strategies in place the night before and the morning of. So at night before school, it's important to think about, what are some calming rituals I can put in place? Some relaxing activities. Do them with your children. There's such a power in modeling with your children. So calming down strategies, let's do them together, right? Go on YouTube and find a mindfulness. There's something called body scan, where you kind of relax every part of your body. So you're starting the evening in a calm way and thinking of some positive self-statements together. And then you're reminding them again in the morning and giving them some space in the morning, understanding they need a minute. Maybe they're learning some cognitive skills in therapy and they need a minute to think about them. Remind them of their incentives, but also remind them of what the consequences will be, and keep calm as much as that's difficult. Refrain from adding pressure or having an emotional reaction. If nothing else is working and the child needs to stay home from school, you've tried everything you can, keep it as boring as possible. Some families have apps where they can turn the internet off and only allow them access to devices after school hours. You can give them chores or schoolwork to do. Meals should be pretty boring as well, and you might even pack it as if they were going to school. There should be no rewards, no fun snacks, no play dates, or any outside activities. To help children with ADHD be more supportive at home with work, you can establish routines. So here on the right is a visual timer that I love, because sometimes when children have ADHD, the sense of time can be really thrown off. Having something visual where they can physically see how much time is left is helpful. Also, having a schedule, which I'll show you a sample of in a moment. But when they're doing their work, you also want to support the work completion. Help them schedule and plan out how they're going to do it. Check in with them and provide those understandings. Are you understanding what's going on? Do we need to shift how we're planning? And also provide a supportive home environment. Easier said than done, I know, but keeping your expectations consistent and routine. They can read through the lines when they see there's inconsistency. Praise them when you see them working hard, even if it's not correct. Praise them for the effort, because there's so many difficulties for kids who have ADHD with academic struggles, and there's so many things that are hard. So do praise them for their effort. Here's a sample schedule just to show that it's important to include a brain break, which means literally giving their brain a break. For some kids who have hyperactivity as part of their ADHD, they might need some wall push-ups, doing some jumping jacks, running back and forth in the hallway. For some kids, it might just mean focusing on something else that they like for a moment. And it's important you keep this routine as much as you can the same. If none of what we've talked about is working and the child is getting therapy and it's just not enough, we now need to think, what are other options? The first is to make sure, and this might already be in place, but you talk to the school. You're already in communication about these functions and struggles, but now what do? We might want to request an IEP or a 504, which will give certain supports that the child, it's mandated that the child receives, whether it be a smaller class, whether it be a pullout for reading support, whether it be a partner work or one-on-one with a teacher. We need to make sure they have the supports based on the function, right? So if it's social and presentations, we want to make sure they're getting smaller practice with presentation in the classroom. You also might have to consider alternate school settings where there's more support or less children in a classroom. So a smaller class or a therapeutic school. And it's last on this list, but it's important to consider that medication might be needed if the child's anxiety is so impairing that none of the different strategies we discussed today were helping. For the resources I used today, you can go to Child Mind Institute website. But like mentioned earlier, there are many, many resources on all sorts of learning disabilities and childhood disorders. The National Resource on ADHD and the Columbia University Clinic for Anxiety and Related Disorders as well.
Thank you, Alana. That was such an informative discussion, and we have so many questions, really great questions. But before we start the Q&A, I'd like to share the final results from today's poll question. We asked, what is the primary reason for your child's school refusal or avoidance? 32% said social difficulties, 22% said academic struggles, 21% said depression or another condition, and 18% said something else. So that's pretty interesting. Now let's get right to your questions. Of course, we had a lot of questions around boundaries, and this one question is, how can I tell if my child is truly physically sick or if the physical symptoms are anxiety related when my child isn't even sure or saying what the problem is?
It's a very good question and a very common question. So I do recommend always talking to the pediatrician just to rule out if sometimes there is a GI issue or a headache. But the patterns are important. So I always tell parents to track it in a journal if you can when you're noticing these symptoms arise. Nighttime is a very common time for these symptoms to arise, as well as other verbal worries or other behaviors. So start tracking them to see if there's a pattern. It's also important to talk to the school, because often schools might think that the child's sick, but it's actually happening the same time every week or the same time every day that they're going to the nurse, and that could be an avoidant behavior. So I always suggest to really track and continue to see the data, which will give you information over time.
Okay, this is similar. How do you validate when a child with school avoidance has severe stomach pain, and we know it's due to anxiety because we've rolled out other conditions, but it makes going to school painful for him? How do we respond to that?
That's another really good question. So I think it starts with validating and really psychoeducating children on what anxiety is. And I think the movie Inside Out too has just really opened eyes for a lot of kids and it helped them feel validated, because there are so many physical symptoms that happen with anxiety. And so it's A, acknowledging your stomach does hurt. I hear and I see you. And B, explaining and helping them understand why and how it's anxiety. Then it's thinking about what supports they can have to make them feel comfortable with that physical pain. Obviously, not all the time medication can help in terms of pain medication, but also really talking to the school about what kind of supports can be put in place, because ultimately identifying what that function is causing the stomach ache will help the stomach ache go down over time. So we want to really identify what's the function to see when that stomach ache is getting worse, and what they might need, if it's a water break, if it's a coping strategy to relax those muscles in the body, because we do know that GI symptoms happen a lot as an anxiety response. So thinking about what kind of coping strategies can be done during the times that the stomach hurts, but also before, preventatively, either at night or in the morning.
We have, this is a really good question about school culture. My 7th grader with ADHD and autism was suspended 7 times last year. He saw this as a reward since he hates school. How can we impact school culture to be more supportive of these struggling kids?
It's a very, very important issue. And as someone who also worked in a school for 15 years, I know that it's very tough because there has to be a consequence, but often kids want to be home. And so they don't feel that consequence. It's important to talk to your school and, again, psychoeducate them on the function of this behavior, right? Coming home and accessing things that they want is not going to, A, teach them a lesson, but B, it's also not going to make them want to come back to school. It's only going to further the problem. So I recommend talking to the school, sharing what school refusal is, what the function you think your child has, and what else can be put in place as a consequence instead of sending them home. Because sending them home, I firmly believe, does not help the child understand. Instead, helping the school and the child think of a logical consequence that has to do with the negative choice that they made in school. That's way more impactful in helping them see the consequence, but also not enforcing the idea of going home, because that's rewarding for so many kids. I see it a lot. So we really need the school to understand what's the function, what's going on, and what else can we think of together It may not be the right school. And unfortunately, there's only so many boundaries we can have or push if the school has certain policies. But it is an important conversation that more schools need to think about, with logical consequence in the school, but not at home.
Speaking of schools, someone writes, my 16-year-old is in a new school after years of school avoidance. She has ADHD, anxiety, and depression. Now she says she wants to quit this new school and quit school altogether. What should I do?
So I have a lot of questions. I hope that the new school knows about the school avoidance behavior. And I would have the child, if they're not in therapy, start thinking about potentially having them in therapy. If they're already in therapy, I would have the therapist and the school coordinate to really start, again, identifying what's the function. Because when we know the function, it opens doors to knowing about different ways to support the child. So if it's about social, evaluative, performance-based situations, right, then we know that we need to add new supports in that school. If they need a gradual entry plan to make school easier so that we don't see school refusal, maybe they need to start with a shorter day, right? Maybe they need to change where they seat, or maybe we need to change how they start when they come into the building and who they meet with, if they meet with the school counselor first. So it's really, really thinking about what their needs are, what's the function, so that it doesn't happen again. But being in a new school, I'm hopeful that the school counselor can be really involved. If there's a therapist, they can really be involved too, to identify the function. So it's like, okay, if it's academic, in what areas do we need to kind of lessen the load? Maybe they need to do some of the homework after school in the building. Maybe that teacher needs to, extend the deadline. And this is not teaching them that can always happen. But during this difficult time, we do need to make adjustments. And then gradually they will get used to it. And gradually we can readjust those expectations. But the school does need to be very aware of what's going on.
This question is from a teacher, so it's sort of the flip side. What is the best way to have conversations with parents about their child's absenteeism in a way that doesn't make the parent feel defensive? She says, this year I had a student who had a very difficult time at his last school, and his parents would keep him home a lot because of it, even though the parents said this year's experience has been much more positive. She's still seeing absenteeism.
Yeah, it's great that it's a little bit more positive. And I do think that it's a good first step to empathize with parents when they see their children struggle. And I can see it from both ends as someone who worked in a school and a parent, that when they're struggling, you just want to help them and save them. But a lot of parents don't realize what we learned about. And so a teacher can kind of educate a parent about that cycle of negative reinforcement. The more we jump in and save them from what they are trying to avoid, the more we're actually making that problem worse, right? And making it less likely for them to just say, okay, I can go to school, because their parents reacting, so they're going to react. So teaching parents about that cycle of negative reinforcement and empathizing with parents, because it can be really hard to do what feels unnatural, which is that exposure piece, having them gradually find a way to re-enter and know that although it feels like there's a problem for the child, the parent needs to check in with their own triggers and say, is this problem a real problem, or an anxious worry thought that the child's having? So talking to the parents to say, think about what the child's saying, kind of talk to your child and say, what are some of their worries? Do those worries seem likely? And again, I always recommend treatment to get that child to start working on some of the cognitive skills that they can learn. But empathizing with the parents and really helping them see that sometimes just keeping them home is making it worse. It can be really hard.
Yeah. What strategies can teachers use to help students who are worn down by criticism and or bullying to build up their self-image?
There's a lot of different things. And it goes back to the function, whether it's, working in a group and having those social anxieties around some kids, thinking about breaking it down. So you can start by thinking of the goal. The goal is to get them to join a group and feel confident, right? So maybe you then kind of break down the steps with the child together and think, okay, so the goal is to have you work as a group and feel confident sharing your opinion, but that's really hard. Maybe on a scale of 1 to 10, that's like a 10 for them. So maybe you start by giving them a partner, and you start by doing that in small increments, and then you might add a third friend to that group. If the anxiety is related to presentation, again, you want to kind of make your own hierarchy and think about the small pieces that you can help them with to achieve confidence as they go along. They're also going to, again, learn that distress tolerance of, this feels uncomfortable, but I can get through it. But we're doing it in small increments in a gradual way. So trying that in your class with the child and getting the parents involved will help too.
Someone asks, are there different strategies for college students with ADHD who are avoiding going to class?
So it's definitely a little different with kids in college. I think making sure you are understanding, again, where it's coming from, if it's academic based. A lot of colleges have support for kids who have ADHD and other challenges, and they're not always known. So when I work with families or children in college, I always say to find out, where are those resources? Who are they? And start to make connections before college start. The summer is a good time, but as school begins, go and make yourself known and find out where and how I can get support. Because, for example, if a child gets quickly overwhelmed with taking notes, there's many note-taking programs in college. But there's also a lot of tutoring programs or writing assistance. So it's identifying their function in college first, whether it's the executive functioning piece, whether it's the organization in class when they're taking notes, or just coming home and having trouble studying, and then thinking of what supports they can implement based on the function of their anxiety of school refusal.
Someone asks, how can this be handled in a virtual school or homeschooled atmosphere?
So we did see a lot of this during COVID. And in fact, I think school avoidant and refusal behaviors increased since COVID. And it's more challenging because you have less access to less resources. But again, it's thinking about the function, right? So if it's about the workload, you might want to start decreasing the workload and thinking about how we can gradually get them to work on small things and then increase that workload more and more. If it's about the social aspect where they're embarrassed in front of friends and worried about being judged, you might have them meet in smaller group. You might have them have their camera off for some and then gradually put that camera on. You might, meet again with the parents. And if there's a therapist involved, to think where they're at on their hierarchy, and it's shifting the expectation. That's the hardest part for schools, but the biggest takeaway is that we have to meet the child where they're at on their hierarchy, or if we push them too far, it's not going to be successful. So really thinking, what are they avoiding? What's the hardest part for them virtually? If it's the screen or if it's the work or not having someone work with them, what supports can the parent put in place in the home as much as they can, or accessing resources outside the home?
Okay. In your experience, how often does school refusal in high school continue at the college level?
This is a hard question. I think it really depends on the child and their access to resources. It's also, some children may have medication where things move along a little faster if they were really stuck in high school. So it really is a hard question to answer as an umbrella answer, but it's identifying where their struggles are the most. I see it mostly in middle school and high school. So I don't see it as much in college, but we really want to think about what supports are in place to get them to college, what they need before they get there.
Okay. Someone asks, how do ADHD kids respond typically to exposure therapy when they also have problems with working memory and applying what they've learned to perform?
It's a great question. We make sure that the exposure therapy plan, the hierarchy, is very based on the child's needs. So we can't move too fast on that hierarchy, because executive function skills are typically low and it can feel really overwhelming. So we make the hierarchy. I always make the hierarchy with the child. So we basically make each step very simple on what we're practicing. And then the child and the family are going to practice them throughout the week. And depending on the child, we determine a schedule on how often they're going to do that exposure practice, whether it be driving to and from school and getting in and out of the car, whether it be at home, getting their stuff ready and their backpack packed. The idea is meeting them where they're at. So for some kids, they can follow a few more commands at once, but typically it's very hard for children with ADHD to follow too many steps. And so we want to keep it simple and meet them where they're at. So finding a step on the hierarchy that's simple, and it's pretty much a one-step process that they can follow.
Someone asks, what do we do when the avoidance is due to burnout from workload and there's not much that can be controlled about that?
that's challenging when we're up against schools who are just kind of, this is how it is, and we can't change the workload. And that's when it might be time to consider a different setting academically if there's only so much the school is willing to change. I have found that even the most rigid schools, when they understand what's going on, they learn about school refusal, they learn about the function and what's going on behind what they see on the outside, they might be more willing to be flexible. But if they simply cannot be any more flexible, it might not be the right fit. And that can be really hard, but we want children to like being in school again, right? And so it can be a really hard decision as a parent to change schools, but an important one if we need to help them be successful.
This is difficult. Someone asked, how does oppositional defiance disorder compare with these symptoms and strategies? How effective are they?
So oppositional defiance can make it a bit more complicated in terms of the purpose or the function, right? When there's kids who have oppositional defiance, the function of their behavior is a little bit differently in terms of something they might want. If it's attention seeking from their peers or attention seeking from parents. So I always recommend working with a clinician if there's something that falls a little bit differently out of the realm of some of the diagnoses we talked about today.
Someone asked, can school refusal spiral into negative and suicidal comments, such as, I'm so stupid, I hate myself, I want to jump off a bridge and die?
It can happen, and it's something to really be aware of. When a child is saying negative things, you want to seek treatment as immediately as you can. When they're starting to talk negatively about themselves as a child's in school, as a child's in the social realm, you want to pick up on that right away. So the hope is that before it gets to the place of suicidal ideation, we are helping them cope. We're giving them strategies through therapy. We're working with the school to find school more bearable for them before it gets to the suicidal ideation. Does it happen that they can sometimes fall into depression? Yes. But again, that's when treatment will be really crucial here, especially medication if a child is feeling very depressed.
Okay. How can we help a child who becomes explosive due to sensory overload from engaging in exposure?
That's a really good question. So again, it's important we do it very gradually, and we teach them the coping skills. In that case, if we know they have a very hard or kind of a low threshold for emotion regulation, we might teach them the coping strategies before we teach them the cognitive skills. We'll have them practice at home. We'll have them practice in the therapy room. We'll have the therapist practice live in the moment with them so that they're using those strategies as they notice the physical sensations build. When we talked about that cognitive triangle of thought, feeling, and action, we also help kids really learn what happens in my body when I have different emotions. So we want to build their emotion intelligence, right? What's going on when I feel happy? What's going on when I feel nervous or scared? And often things can overlap. So we really want to help them understand my heart is racing because I'm excited versus a lot of different things are happening in my body because I'm feeling nervous, excited, and angry at the same time. So we really want to help them understand what's happening in my body. What am I feeling? And then they can start to use a coping strategy before they access those cognitive skills. And so it takes really knowing the child and what's going on for them. But before they become explosive, we want to help them identify those feelings in their body.
Okay, well, unfortunately, that has to be our last question because we're out of time. But Alana, thank you so much for such a great presentation. Thank you for joining us today and sharing your expertise with our ADHD community. We really appreciate it.
Of course, thank you so much for having me.
And thank you to today's listeners. If you would like to access the event resources, visit attitudemag.com and search podcast 512. The slides and recording are posted a few hours after each live webinar. If you're listening in replay mode, simply click on the episode description. Please know that our full library of Attitude webinars is available as a podcast. It's called the ADHD Experts Podcast, and it's available on all streaming platforms. Make sure you don't miss future Attitude webinars, articles, or research updates by signing up to receive our free email newsletters at attitudemag.com/newsletters. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
For more Attitude podcasts and information on living well with attention deficit, visit attitudemag.com. That's ADDITUDEMAG.com.
It's time to gather loved ones together for all the holidays' best spread. Lynn's has great prices on all your favorite Thanksgiving items, from delicious turkey with all the fixings to mashed potatoes and yummy pies. We have everything you need to create your perfect Thanksgiving dinner. Whether it's cooking the traditional meal, completely store-bought, or a combination of both, your best holiday meal starts here. Learn more and start shopping today at lynsgrocery.com. Lynn's, where delicious begins.